The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I would like to start this second half of today's conference on the panel one. Today's panel will discuss the lessons of COVID-19 and how the military adapted to the situation and how those lessons will apply to future planning. For today, the panel will be led by Professor Braun from the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. Again, all the bios of the panelists are available at the kcis.org front page. And for those who want to follow on Twitter, you can follow at the KCIS 2021 handle. At this time, I will turn it over to Professor Braun to introduce his panel.
Yes, as I said, the Q&A, if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists, post them to the Q&A spot tab at the bottom of the Zoom page. I'll collect those and we will sort them and answer them at the end of the three presentations. And as our Master of Ceremonies said, the bios are available at the KCIS webpage, so I won't go into a great deal of depth here to be sure we give our speakers all the possible time. This panel is title is The Pandemic as a Lesson in Military Adaptations. And we have three speakers to accomplish the three missions that our panel was charged with. The first speaker will describe the environment that motivated the conference theme. Our second speaker will introduce the military's role in the pandemic response, which is a carrier wave theme throughout the conference. And our third speaker will expand the dialogue and thinking regarding national preparedness for future crisis, perhaps precipitated by a more purposeful attack on the homeland than a pandemic. Our first speaker, Nate Fryer, is an associate professor of national security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. He has a military background as a field artilleryman, worked for General Odierno in many assignments, one of them being an advisor during his last tour in Iraq. He's also served in the DoD policy and as a CSI think tanker in DC. His defense expertise is in defense and military strategy and policy development, strategic planning, net and risk assessment, strategic forecasting, and international futures security. With that, I'll tell you that Nate is going to establish a context for not just this panel, but the entire KCIS theme by describing the changing character of contextual and purposeful threats to the homeland from 2021 to today. And he'll introduce the possibility of cascading failure precipitating a national emergency. Our second speaker, Brigadier General Krista Brody, is going to talk to us. Well, she was the Vice President for Logistics and Operations for the Public Health Agency of Canada. And during her time there, she was heavily engaged with supply chain issues associated with the pandemic. She's currently the commander of the Military Personnel Generation Group, which leads a tireless and talented team at the heart of the Canadian Armed Forces recruiting and individual training experience. Her previous background is as a logistician, military logistician at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. She has had multiple deployments to Croatia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and served on NATO and the United Nations. Most importantly to me, she's also an accomplished paratrooper. Our General Brody is going to focus her comments on the carrier theme for the conference, which is the military, particularly the Canadian military's role in the pandemic response. Our third speaker is Quinn Lucy. Quinn joined DHS just recently in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans, where he is engaged with the infrastructure and risk resilience operations and policies that the U.S. is currently updating. Previously, he was a member of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the U.S., in the Office of the Chief Counsel. He has participated in that group since 2006. So he is very familiar with the issues that we're talking about today and has written extensively on them. And Quinn will expand the conversation beyond the focal carrier wave of the pandemic to highlight the need to improve national resiliency and the challenges of achieving preparedness in planning, exercises, and assessments prior to a purposeful threat attack on the homeland. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Nate Fryer, who is going to discuss the context of this conference.
So thanks, Trey. I appreciate the invitation and the kind introduction. Thanks to KCIS for having me talk today. You know, as a preliminary, I think as I'm speaking from Minnesota, I think there will be some online today that suggest that I'm practically attending this conference in person. So there is that. In spite of the overall focus of the event on the military response to COVID and the lessons learned from there, I think that I'm actually playing a bit of the role of the Prince of Darkness in this particular event, as I'm discussing the broad challenges to Homeland Security and the transformation of the Homeland Security environment. My comments will be specifically addressed toward how they impact the United States, but I think more broadly, they're applicable across all advanced nations and especially U.S. partners. So again, purposeful actors being bad actors with bad intent. One thing I think that will be a cross-cutting, we'll be cross-cutting across everybody's presentations throughout this conference, really will be this idea of catastrophe and cascading failure and how emergencies in the homeland can actually trigger those and how governments across the board might be able to respond better. Next slide, please, if I could. Actually, you can flip 2 slides forward to the agenda. Here's a quick scan of the agenda that I'm going to go over. I will cover these 11 points as quickly as possible, perhaps too quickly in some cases, but I do look forward to a lively discussion. You can see that I'm going to start with some preliminaries and end really with a conclusion on where exactly I believe that the Homeland Security problem sits currently today. And if I could go to the preliminaries and boundaries slide, that'd be great. So next slide. The work I'm going to present and discuss today really started in October of 2020. We were still deep in the pandemic, obviously, and we still are to this day. But at that time, in October 2020, U.S. Army researchers initiated a multi-year study on Homeland Security strategy. Within that work, we were part of a smaller group focused on identifying, we were the threat team focused on identifying and describing the next decade's purposeful threats to U.S. Homeland Security. We believe this work has wide applicability across partner governments and institutions, and naturally, the one disclaimer I have to make is this does not reflect the official position of the United States government, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. So with that, next slide, please. When we started our work in October 2020, we were charged with a very simple role. If you could go to the next chart, I see I'm still on preliminaries. We were charged with this mission statement: identify and describe the pacing, purposeful Homeland Security threat actors, vectors, and effects that should drive strategic planning through 2030. as I stated in our previous charts. While DHS in the US is responsible for all hazards, we focus specifically on purposeful threat actors, vectors, and effects that should pace Homeland Security planning over the next decade. Next chart, please. Our North Star in the work that we did was really the national preparedness goal promulgated by the Department of Homeland Security and seen here in the middle of this chart. It is, for all intents and purposes, DHS's mission statement. And from that mission statement, we inferred the requirement to identify and describe what we would call pacing threats to Homeland Security, those being the most important threats for strategic planning going forward. Next chart, please. Here's the bottom line. We had 5 core insights, and I'll review them very quickly here. First, the contemporary HLS landscape involves a perpetual battle against both purposeful and contextual threats. I'll talk about those in a bit. Purposeful threats to Homeland Security are accelerated and enabled in the United States' case, at least, by post-primacy and hyper-competition, again, concepts I will talk about in a bit. Among purposeful threats, the pacers are those that harbor game-changing potential for catastrophic acts or campaigns. In our view, at the end of our work, there were 2 current pacing threat actor types that the United States and probably all advanced nations and partner nations need to be aware of, and that is great power rivals and probably most controversially, network domestic extremists. Catastrophic pacers increasingly resist authority and resist U.S. influence through the gray zone, exhibiting the 3 key characteristics of gray zone challenges of hybridity, menace to convention, and risk confusion. The bottom line is we believed at the end of our work that the United States was entering a period of substantial insecurity and vulnerability at home, and I think this would apply to all advanced Western democracies as well. Next slide, please. This is a quick glimpse of the mental model of what we would call the Homeland Security threatscape. You can look at this model from right to left, threat actors through the national preparedness goal, threat actors on the right through the national preparedness goal on the left, or left to right, from the preparedness goal through threat effects, vectors, and pacing threat actors. I'll discuss this again in greater detail at the end of the discussion, but our view is that this captures in one visual the way that we see the current Homeland Security universe as it relates to purposeful threats. I wanted to point one thing out. Kind of a late ad for me when I went through these charts is you have purposeful threat actors that exist in some context, and that context is reflected across the middle of this chart in sort of the orange, red, and purple shading. So next chart, please. There is a broad Homeland Security remit, and I would argue that we are all prisoners of our past. In this case, preparing for this event, I found that the concept of purposeful and contextual threats were very helpful for me to think about how to actually address the former in the context of the latter. I was the progenitor, I think, of these concepts initially in a CSIS report of some 11 years ago that we wrote on behalf of SOCOM. The bottom line really, though, is that purposeful threats are bad actors with bad intent, and contextual threats are those threats that just are. They're products of the environment. The yellow box in the middle, I think, actually helps explain the relationship that exists between the two. While floods, fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, and civil disorder are, of course, distinct from attack by a hostile power group, they can be symbiotic as well. While the latter contextual threat emerges unguided from the environment, the former purposeful threat can grow from, free ride on, or exploit context. And this is directly out of the forthcoming conference paper that I'm putting out. Next chart, please. So again, we've done a great deal of recent work on change in the global security environment, and Though it's a hard act to follow, the acting CDS is a hard act to follow. We too have done some work in that regard. He spoke very eloquently on it, and I will speak to a certain extent on it here. Our key insights on the contemporary environment fall basically in two categories. The first category is that of post-primacy, which emerged really in a report At Our Own Peril, which was chartered by the Department of Defense to talk about risk in the contemporary environment. And you can see the 5 main characteristics of post-primacy. I won't bore you with reading them out here, but these really kind of set the plate for where we're at today, not only in the international arena beyond U.S. borders, but also help define the homeland security threat as well. And then finally, hyper-competition is sort of enabled by post-primacy, and that's this persistent struggle to gain, exploit, and regain transient advantage across and within highly contested domains and competitive spaces. Our contention actually is that rivals of many stripes are increasingly engaged in hyper-competition with the United States in particular, but with all rival governments in general. Next chart, please. So what makes a PACER? So we thought a great deal about what makes a pacing homeland security threat because it was part of our remit. At its core, a PACER is defined by its potential for catastrophic effect on target governments, institutions, people, and norms and critical functions. In the middle of the chart, you'll see how we characterize a PACER, a pacing purposeful threat. And we suggest that using a definition like this actually focuses the mind and provides a worst case sort of target for HLS strategy and strategic planning going forward. Next chart, please. Again, a little more on what makes a PACER. In our view, it's this idea of catastrophic acts or campaigns. We needed to be crystal clear about what these terms meant, and we drew our inspiration for the definition of catastrophic act or campaign from that of catastrophic incident that's included in US code. At the center of this chart, you see our view of catastrophic act or campaign as well as that of cascading failure. And I'll pause here just for a moment to just talk about this idea that, again, a catastrophic threat is that's purposeful, disruptive, destructive, damaging, and lethal. It has the capability of triggering cascading failure. And cascading failure, of course, implies failure within a system or network that hazards or results in more generalized failure across some kind of interconnected or interdependent set of systems or networks. Next chart, please. Pacing threats are going to attack along 5 threat vectors according to our work. You see the 5 laid out here, from resources and economics down to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. But the red box in particular we think is most important because that seems to be the space that most purposeful threat actors are operating in currently. We would actually suggest more specifically that the cognitive, social, and civic vector and the cyberspace and electromagnetic specter are perhaps proving to be the most troublesome for the United States in particular to handle. But all of these vectors individually and in combination have the potential for catastrophe. Next chart, please. What are threat actors trying to accomplish? Well, we've broken that down into 4 categories. We suggest they want to co-opt, corrode, coerce, and or cripple target governments, institutions, and people. Co-opting is divide, exploit, and conquer. Corrode is destroy an institution or government from the inside out, or its ability to govern. Coerce is to dissuade, deter, or defeat action that is unfavorable to those that are perpetrating actions. And cripple is to paralyze or exploit vulnerability. And the key on the cripple category is it is damage to such an extent that recovery is required. Recovery of normal function is substantial recovery is required before you can anticipate that some kind of normal function is restored to a society. Next chart, please. So we did name names, and it was somewhat controversial at times when we did name names. We identified two principal pacing threats to U.S. homeland security going forward: great power rivals on the one hand, Russia and China, and network domestic extremists on the other. Great power rivals are revisionist actors seeking some kind of permanent redistribution of power at U.S. expense. And network domestic extremists are homegrown rejectionists actively pursuing illegitimate forcible change to legal authority. They can be anti-government or they can be accelerationist in their orientation. The anti-government crowd obviously is attempting through activity to counter the legal authority of an existing government. Accelerationists are trying to actually trigger some kind of conflict within society between competing groups. One thing I want to emphasize that we actually find particularly important to this consideration is network domestic extremists are not, one, Americans engaged in protest, civil disobedience, or civil disorder occurring in response to some perceived social injustice. And they are not Americans petitioning their government for change through mass social mobilization. We think that the key to understanding the network domestic extremist problem is that they have to fit these four characteristics: that they are aggrieved, they are hyperconnected and active, they're seditious, and they're capably armed. And armed is in quotations there because armed can mean a lot of things, not just violence, but capably armed could be capably armed in the cyber realm or the electromagnetic spectrum realm, or in the ability to manipulate the COGS social civic realm, etc. So I think those are very important points to make. We're not declaring war on Americans protesting against their government, I think is the important point here. Next slide, please. There is the potential for a foreign and domestic nexus. Just very briefly, not only have we seen that in the past with jihadist terrorism, but I think even now with extreme right-wing groups, white supremacists, etc., we're finding some symbiotic relationships between external rivals of all stripes and groups like this. So what we're looking at in the nexus is great power rivals and network domestic extremists and foreign extremists teaming up, or all three of them combining efforts toward common goals. And I think what's really important in this chart is this bottom yellow box. They can act collectively, meaning in combined effort. They can be coordinated, meaning they could act on issue-specific cooperation. And their actions can be complementary, meaning independent action towards shared or parallel goals. And then finally, there's some opportunistic opportunity there as well, where they bandwagon on a pre-existing problem. Next slide, please. Our last insight really is that the homeland security threat is a gray zone threat. Here you see a description of the gray zone in our terms. It features these three characteristics of hybridity, menace to convention, and risk confusion, lies between classic war and peace, et cetera, et cetera. We lay that out in a now 5-year-old report outplayed that you see in the bottom right-hand corner. But more importantly, I think if you go to the next chart, here's how we see this really playing out. The gray zone threat actors will exploit the gray zone to limit exposure and complicate their target's response options. And they will combine lower risk, higher payoff activities to actually achieve their ends. Second, they will combine hybrid cocktails of methods and capabilities using the 5 vectors to trigger catastrophe. And the more creative and unconventional that they are, the likelier their approaches will be to confound the slow-moving and heavily traveled U.S. security bureaucracy. As far as menace to convention goes, their acts will be so unconventional and at times so difficult to identify, characterize, and attribute that they will defy both effective defense and response. Naturally, one of the other key characteristics of a gray zone threat is that they muddle the peace war boundary, but in the case of domestic actors, they also muddle the legitimate civic action and criminal boundary as well. What this does to a target government, obviously, is muddle the target government's boundaries, separating just plain continued vigilance, preemption, or perhaps aggressive counteraction. Then finally, threat actors will leave policymakers risk confused. This meaning that the reciprocal cost of escalation will appear to outweigh the near-term benefits of aggressive response to provocation, for example, where attribution is problematic and the boundaries are muddled, will automatically challenge concepts like legitimacy and proportionality. And I think that there's a particular problem with domestic actors. In the case of domestic actors, prevention is highly problematic until obvious criminal activity occurs. And by then, our work suggests that catastrophe may already be well in train. Next slide, please. Again, here's the model. I don't want to go over it in detail, but understand that we identified a set of pacing threat actors. Again, the pacers, those that are capable of catastrophic acts or campaigns. The threat vectors are the general paths and tools that they will use to actually achieve their ends. The effects are the ends that they're looking to achieve, and the national preparedness goal and how we actually look at the problem ultimately needs to actually adapt to this model. Next slide, please. Here again are the 5 core insights from our recent work, and this concept that the United States is entering a period of substantial insecurity and vulnerability at home. And then finally, my conclusion: threat actors are more numerous. The vectors available to them for harm are myriad and complex. Next slide, please. The effects they can achieve are more far-reaching, devastating, and durable than they have been in the past. And combined, all of these indicate a much more complex problem set for HLS leadership. And as HLS leaders endeavor to plan for an all-hazards environment, a thorough reconsideration of the purposeful threat is in order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. And we're going to hold the questions until the end. So General Brody, if you'd like to give your presentation, that would be great.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you today from Ottawa on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. As we face a crisis of culture and leadership and a long-awaited reckoning with sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, I also acknowledge that when we, as individuals and as an institution, stray from the better values of the profession of arms, we cause harm. As the acting CDS emphasized in his opening address, we are determined to be better and to do better. It is an existential imperative that we change our culture. Segueing from Nate's comments regarding the changing character of threats, I'll offer a few comments in the spirit of a micro case study into COVID-19 pandemic response in the Canadian context to highlight considerations around the changing character of domestic responses. The Canadian Armed Forces, the CAF, found itself in uncharted territory throughout Canada's pandemic response, far outside the comfortable combat roles. From a multitude of roles under the auspices of Operation Laser, which was the activation of Contingency Plan Laser, the CAF response to a worldwide influenza-like pandemic, including multi-purpose medical assistance teams in long-term care facilities, wide-ranging support to First Nations communities, planning and logistics support to established testing sites at land ports of entry, critical care support in provincial hospitals, and aeromedical evacuations, to name a few. To Operation Vector, the CAF support to federal, provincial, and territorial governments for the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, primarily by means of a planning and operations team embedded within the Public Health Agency of Canada. And in the early months of the pandemic, the embedding of a team of logistics planners within the Public Health Agency to develop the warehousing and distribution plan for the millions of dollars of personal protective equipment that have been purchased by the Government of Canada. The statutory authority or legal basis for most domestic CAF operations of this nature derives from the National Defence Act in section 273.61, which encompasses any duty involving public service. The standard mechanism for activating CAF assistance in these instances is the request for assistance, the RFA, staffed via Public Safety Canada. Public Safety Canada ensures coordination across all federal departments and agencies responsible for national security and the safety of Canadians. Their mission, build a safe and resilient Canada. A comprehensive RFA, as the acting CDS mentioned, was developed to streamline consideration and approval of the vast number and array of RFAs that came to and continue to come into the CAF as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The CAF's response has been comprehensive, including regular and reserve forces, Canadian Rangers, defense civilians, informed units, task-tailored teams, and ad hoc assemblies of individual augmentees embedded in departments, agencies, and at all levels across the enterprise. If I can cloud seed 3 messages from the outset. The first, Canada's COVID-19 response has been a mobilization effort predicated on partnerships, on trust and collaboration across all levels of governments, industry, and society, unprecedented in our contemporary experience. The second, while the tenet of unlimited liability is unique to the military does not hold the monopoly on the tenet of service before self. There are citizens in echelons wide and deep across the land and around the world in thousands of different capacities who have stepped up and sacrificed much in the interests of the common good. And the third, we are all connected in this crisis. It has and will continue to demand of us a level of global collaboration and cooperation that transcends cultural and geopolitical differences and unites us all against a common foe, a foe that continues to kill on our collective watch, even with known and effective preventatives. It's a sobering thought and a clarion call for humanity. I'll touch on a few themes that bear further exploration and thought: national resilience, preparedness, jurisdictional challenges, and public-private partnerships. My sense is that the pandemic has expanded our frame of reference for a whole of government approach. What we are embarked upon is truly a whole of nation endeavor. And I would suggest that we did so and continue to do so on an ad hoc basis. The Federal Emergency Measures Act was not enacted, even though many provincial and territorial jurisdictions enacted local or regional states of emergency. It begs the question, if not for this, then for what? I am sure that there are many legal, policy, and academic and opinion discussions on the future of our federal emergency response framework. We have claimed the language without necessarily owning or yet realizing or operationalizing to the full extent the obligation to adapt our structures and systems to formalize, protect, and foster the foundational gains that have been made. We need to code the COVID-19 experience into the DNA of our collective conscience and culture so that we move decisively beyond our traditional response and recovery postures to a more robust, integrated preparation and prevention model. For military minds, preparation is informed and assessed by means of our sometimes pedantic and disciplined approach to intelligence and logistics preparation of the battle space. We quickly discovered that there is a distinct lack of capacity to survey national capabilities in a quick and coherent way across critical sectors in Canada. When the team first reached out from the National Operations Center in the early days of October and November of 2020 to the provinces and territories to assess the extant cold chain capacity across the enterprise, it started with a question, what do you have? Where is it? How much capacity does that represent? Are your freezers certified? Are they licensed in terms of drug establishment licenses? The answers were a stunning, stunning silence. There is no magic overlay that gave all of that information and fed it all into a central hub or agency. It was very much a phone call by phone call, an old-fashioned call that called to other people, that called to other people, and then aggregated and cascaded that information back, sometimes in very painful ways with very long lead times. And then we turned and asked the question, what is available to order? And the answer came back relatively quickly. 9 freezers in Ontario, in Canada, no, in the world. And then the what? And in that moment, it was like a switch flipped, and we realized the scope and magnitude of just what needed to be accomplished. And then that mindset, let's innovate, improvise, and build the impossible on a ridiculously accelerated timeline, working with manufacturers across the world and around the globe to be able to align resources. That sense of urgency, we talk about a sense of urgency, and I've experienced it in operations, but never to this extent. That sense of the vaccines are coming, people are dying on our watch, every dose matters, that there must be no wastage between manufacturers overseas and when the vaccines arrive in the arms of Canadians in remote reaches of the tundra and everywhere in between. The team built from scratch 2 distinct cold chains, ultra low temperature for Pfizer-BioNTech, and it's cold, -60 to -90 in thermal shipping containers, -130 to -76 with dry ice, and then a distinct cold chain at -20 for Moderna. When we appreciate them now, they're elegant in their simplicity, but the aggregate of the complexities to make it real was astonishing. It was no small victory to arrive at the first 14 on the 14th of December, 2020, and to get Moderna into the north. Preparation was both impeded and informed by jurisdictional challenges in the Canadian context. In Canada, healthcare falls within provincial and territorial jurisdictions with funding support via transfer payments from the federal government. It is also extremely important to acknowledge the roles and relationships with Indigenous peoples, First Nations health authorities, and Indigenous Services Canada within that broader FBTI ecosystem. Allocations were carefully considered through the principles of equity and transparency, and prioritizing vulnerable populations through the months of vaccine scarcity. The Federal Minister of Health oversees the health portfolio in Canada, 5 organizations, Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada being the 2 highest profile in the context of pandemic response. Health Canada is critical because it is the federal regulatory approving body for the COVID-19 vaccines. The Public Health Agency is charged with the prevention of and responding to public health emergencies and infectious disease outbreaks, with the exception of a very small team that coordinates operational responses to outbreaks like H1N1 and Ebola. They are largely focused and structured around developing public health policy. At the outset of COVID-19 pandemic, they were not structured, staffed, or designed culturally or practically to operationalize a pandemic response at scale. Hence the ask for planning and ops teams to scale up the vaccine distribution operation. The provincial and territorial healthcare systems operate relatively autonomously with deep-rooted distrust and both a reluctance and an inability to share information on critical capabilities. There was no common user digitalized platform or set of processes. Provinces and territories are used to ordering 2 to 8 degree vaccines directly from manufacturers to support their routine vaccination childhood programs or as part of federal influenza campaigns. COVID-19 vaccines were only available at the federal level via nationally negotiated contracts, and the cold chain requirements, ULT and -20, were outside their scope and experience. Nascent FBTI governance tables matured rapidly during the pandemic, evolving into a robust network of mutually supporting working groups and advisory bodies that fed into senior ministerial level forums. At the tactical level, the team built bridges, trust, relationships, and IT systems the old-fashioned way, one phone call at a time, one email at a time, establishing and leveraging the National Operations Center as the central control hub for vaccine distribution, and aggregating information, whether it was on ancillary equipment, dry ice kits, freezers, vaccine delivery sites, in spreadsheets, managing the allocation, demand ordering, and distribution of millions of vaccines to thousands of different locations, everything from centralized provincial depots to individual clinics and remote and isolated communities and First Nations nursing stations, first via Excel spreadsheets, then with an in-house SMS-based system, and finally, in June, at the height of the big lift, launching into midstream the first iteration of an SAP-based intelligent supply chain module that continues to evolve as an inventory management tool for Canada's strategic vaccine supply. Try maintaining material accountability down to the dose and keeping your data clean when several million doses are moving on any given day. Your data injects are coming in from at least 3 different incompatible systems, and in-transit visibility extends to needing to know the precise temperature of each package at every moment in its journey. What the Close Fight team accomplished on any given day was nothing short of extraordinary. But you don't get vaccines without manufacturing or procuring them. And in Canada, we don't yet manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. Procurement then takes on primordial importance. Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC, proved to be remarkably and perhaps uncharacteristically agile in their procurement strategy for COVID-19 vaccines, and set the foundations for our working relationships with the manufacturers of the 4 vaccines approved for use in Canada. PSPC also was key in landing our PPE warehouse and distribution contracts and negotiating the contracting instruments for our logistics service provider, LSP, a partnership of unprecedented scale that essentially acts as a 2-way national supply chain for a significant portion of Canada's COVID-19 vaccines. It provides central inventory management, think of it as our national strategic reserve, and distribution services as coordinated and directed via the NOC. Industry partnerships are absolutely critical to the success of Canada's COVID-19 vaccine distribution campaign. The CAF offers a measure of redundancy and resilience, but the heavy lifting is done by the logistics service provider in accordance with the instructions issued by the National Operations Center, embedded within the Public Health Agency. In conclusion, the evolving nature of purposeful and contextual threats and the corresponding evolution in the nature of domestic operations demands a rethinking of the structures and systems, legal and practical, that shape our identity as an instrument of national power, as well as our international and internal relationships. It is time to frame a modern mobilization mindset, one that is mindful of both the resource constraints and the realities of the future operating environment. We must collectively commit to elevating our foundational and surge capacities, institutionalize the myriad best practices learned the hard way over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, commit to continuous improvement and to prevention and resilience as foundational antidotes to the disruptions we will certainly face going forward. We need to own our whole of nation approach. Our security is intrinsically woven in the warp and weft of public-private partnerships in the broadest possible sense and interpretation, in every facet of society and at every level of government. In the tapestry of tumult and tension that is our current and future operating environment, the time is now for both a reckoning and a reimagining of what we want our armed forces to be in the world and at home. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for that. And Quinn, if you'd like to go ahead, I won't take any of your time.
Thank you, Trey, and thank you again, KCIS, and all those for the opportunity to speak today. And I'll say before I start how struck I was by the similar experience that I saw this last year, and I think our nation as a whole saw how similar that experience was to the one we just heard from General Brody, and how so much of what happened with our neighbors to the north, we dealt with those same issues and dealt with them in sometimes the same ways or with the same impediments as they did. So as I begin this short talk, I have 6 points I kind of want to go through. The first one is, national emergency resilience language. What is an emergency? What is a national, for instance, security emergency? The second one is the need for left-to-bang preparation, and particularly in the context of the last 30 years here in the United States of our national capabilities and preparations focusing on natural hazards, regional natural hazards, as compared to the potential preparations that my old employer, FEMA, did in its first iteration, its first decade, preparing for a catastrophic war with the Soviet Union and the systems they built up during the Cold War for a true whole of nation, whole of government response and coordination and framework. Third, briefly, the Federalist System challenge here in the United States, which may or may not be similar to the nations of those on this call today, and how that affects things here in the United States. The fourth is the absolute necessity of public-private partnerships. That's something I think you just heard, again, the importance of that, and I can touch some on that with our experience in the Supply Chain Task Force that I participated in last year at FEMA. The fifth, the military's mission tension, really, the support, what we often call United States defense support of civil authorities, Department of Defense, federal U.S. troops utilize to support the needs of state and local governments, most notably, again, during natural hazard response. That tension between that and the need for those same capabilities potentially to reorient towards their primary wartime or primary national security responsibilities. And the sixth is, again, kind of a background in the sense the nature and disconnects in the law and presidential directives relative to national resiliency and national security emergency preparedness. So the event that we've seen and continues with COVID-19, many of those activities harken back on the fly, essentially recreated some of the capabilities that the federal government once prepared to use for a conventional war with the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, as I'll speak about it, there's really three generational pots of authorities in the federal government for the United States. There were some immediately after the end of World War II and the Cold War and the Korean War. Defense Production Act was one of those, right? But there were a slew of authorities that were instituted at the end of the Cold War, the late 80s, early 90s. And then again, a third group of authorities that really stood up post 9/11. And unfortunately, none of them truly nest on each other. They often operate in almost parallel worlds, and they experience how that affected us. So with those 6 points, let me go back first to what is an emergency? What does language mean? Well, a national security emergency, for instance, is not found in statute. It's actually found in an executive order from 1988. And it's defined as any occurrence, including natural disaster, military attack, technological emergency, or other emergency that seriously degrades or seriously threatens the national security of the United States. But it is simply one version of the word emergency. So for instance, there is an emergency under the Stafford Act, which is the disaster relief statutes and authority for the federal government to generally assist state and local governments, right? They have a major disaster declaration for the president, but they also have an emergency declaration. They are similar but different, but that definition of emergency is not the same as the one I just read you. There's also the National Emergency Act found in U.S. statutes that allows the president, or I believe the Congress as well, to declare a national emergency. But that declaration in and of itself carries no power. There's nothing in that specific statute that's released. Instead, with that declaration, other statutes, other authorities are now released and available to the Department of Defense, HHS, Health and Human Services, others through that declaration. But there is no standard definition of an emergency. The definition of catastrophe, I think catastrophic, there is one found in the Homeland Security Act, but again, it's really, if anything, it's evidence of generations of thought and work in this area, but unfortunately in the United States, much of it is not nested upon the other. Theme I'll hit at the end. So what truly is an emergency? As I've written to myself before, the American experience over the last many decades at the national level, at least prior to COVID, has been for domestic emergencies for when the federal government is to be supporting role to the states. And collectively as a nation, we haven't had to harness even the partial power of a full whole of nation response prior to last year, and really not since the Korean War, or probably since the energy crises of the 1970s. When I helped bring back the use of voluntary agreements with the Defense Production Act, which relieve companies of antitrust requirements so they can really speak freely with their peers up and above and beside them and with the federal government. When I was writing it, putting it together, I was literally looking at congressional records from the early 50s. The last time I could tell it was even used in a operational sense, and to be fair, our friends at the Maritime Administration still have 2 of these left that they've had in the books for well over a half century. But as far as I could tell, the last time we had to use some of these tools was literally in the energy crises in the United States in the early 1970s, where we had a nationally resource constrained environment. We simply had gone almost half a century before we needed these things, which gets into the left of bang preparation. So the primary organizing framework for coordination in the U.S. is the National Incident Management System, which through grant requirements has essentially been adopted not just by the federal government, but by our states and territories, which has been a great way to trade resources and get commonality. But it was developed out of California for use in multi-jurisdiction wildfires in the early 1970s. It reflects the needs and experience of local responders that have generally ample resources available to them and can call on state and federal governments and other entities for help. Essentially, they operated in an environment of unlimited mutual aid though there were potential time constraints. So the resource management and command and control systems, such as the Incident Command System, which is found in the National Incident Management System, or the multi-agency coordination groups, reflect the genesis of NIMS, National Incident Management System, of these resources that are always available. Maybe they're a county away or a state away, but they will come. And those places are safe. There are places to stage. 3 states away, they do not need those same wildfire fighting services that you do at the moment. Those days are probably gone for a variety of reasons, whether it's these new or rediscovered threats that we've talked about here, or whether it's climate change, where we have essentially through the combination of events and its continuing power, we collectively reach these really high thresholds of loss, whether in lives or in property or value. So again, the tools that we have and we've been using the last 30 years may not necessarily reflect the tools we really truly need to prepare for a future whole of government, whole of nation response, which I would have led off with this, but one of my little elevator pitches is simply, if your government, if your team has plans to move your government or your seat of government to somewhere safe in the mountains, right? If something that bad happens, what is your plan for day 2 through the end of that environment to focus your whole of nation, to focus your whole of government, right? What is that plan? How do you, as you just heard the general speak about, how do we look at entire sectors of industry? How do we look at the nation as a whole? What the United States, about a $21 trillion economy, right? What can that economy as a whole produce? What can it produce, et cetera? And of course, some of the problem with that is that FEMA, once in its first iteration, its first decade, had that responsibility. Its primary responsibility was really national security. Its secondary responsibility was responding to natural hazards, right? So I'll read you real briefly the Federal Preparedness Program as it appeared in FEMA in the mid to late 80s and their responsibilities. So there were about 100 people assigned to this program in around 86, the Federal Preparedness Program at FEMA. The first one was resources preparedness, and this is what it was, quote, designed to assess the vulnerability of the United States to resource shortages. 2, devise resource enhancement programs to reduce the possibility of shortages and prepare resource management plans to mitigate the impact of resource shortages. Think of that nationally, nationwide. 3, provide for a standby system for stabilization of the economy in time of severe emergencies. And 4, provide policy direction and planning for the National Defense Stockpile, something that moved on right after that to the Department of Defense. Secondly, they had a mobilization preparedness group designed to assure the nation has plans, systems, procedures, and resources to support an emergency mobilization, there's that word emergency, which might be necessary for national security purposes as well as for domestic peacetime disasters, both natural and man-made. It will assure essential support to the civilian population in any emergency requiring mobilization of the nation's resources and provide resources from the civil sector to DoD when is required. And the third one was a federal preparedness policy and planning branch that looked at what would be the nation's policy again to do that, which kind of leads into, and I should say, as part of what they did, here's an example. If you can see this, this is something I got from one of our retired planners last year. It is a pharmaceutical industry capability study of the entire US pharmaceutical industry. And you'll notice it's from October 1988, commissioned by FEMA. That is when there used to be programs that theoretically, at least, I can't tell you how useful they would have been, but they at least attempted to look at that big board, as the general explained. They had processes and programs in place to handle resources, to do national resource management, to handle conflicts and resources, to expand industry. They knew who to talk to. So they had various tools I'll talk about in a second, public-private partnerships to do that. But that's an example of programs that once existed that were particularly prepared for use in the Cold War, but never transitioned over into the post-Cold War environment that we're in now. And so part of that too is, again, the federalist system challenge here. So the US Constitution creates a federalist system that gives it great strength, but divides certain inalienable responsibilities between federal and state governments. So natural hazards like floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes, they are the primary responsibility of states and their governors under the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution. But for example, war, on the other hand, is clearly a responsibility of the federal government, the president. The coordination systems developed in the US since the end of the Cold War have almost exclusively been built to support natural hazard responses, with the states in the lead and the federal government support. The legacy systems for the reverse, the federal government leading with the states supporting the United States, were linked almost exclusively to preparing for war and never, as I said, transitioned to the post-Cold War all hazards environment. And we saw that this year. So President Trump last year, under a section of the Stafford Act, section 501B, declared an emergency under the Stafford Act, but it's rarely used. It's only used when the event is of the primary responsibility of the federal government. Essentially, the federal government is in the lead and the states are supporting. And that declaration was done for all states and territories. But as I mentioned, if you look at the systems that have been put in place since 1993, they are all promulgated on the idea of the state and local governments leading, the federal government supporting, because that is the world we have lived in since essentially Hurricane Andrew hit Florida in the early 90s, right? On through Katrina, the 27 hurricanes, a couple earthquakes in the middle of that, obviously wildfires, all natural hazards. When they got really large, regional, but nonetheless not national regional hazards. So a lot of the tools, so again, what happened in that transition? So, I'll read to you from something I found in a memo that the director of FEMA wrote in 1994, I believe it was, the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, who was a little concerned when FEMA shut all these programs down in 93. And the response was this: the need for mobilization functions on a scale sufficient to support mobilization for a major conventional war has virtually vanished. The residual concern, i.e. belligerent and expansionist Russia, or a militarily capable and belligerent China, is remote. Consequently, FEMA's mobilization preparedness functions should be made relevant in light of the post-Cold War environment, which again explains why these tools that honestly would have been very useful when we were on the supply chain task force last year, to have not had to ad hoc, as the general stated, rebuild this national visibility, in our case, over PPE nationwide and with supply chains extending worldwide, right? Those tools, the people who thought about that never transitioned over. And in fact, that particular office of 100 people essentially went to a part-time job for a single person in 93. And I'll give you a perfect example of two things that happened there in that transition. So one, civil defense, you heard General Ayers talk about that earlier, right? Well, the Civil Defense Act, passed in 1950, was extinguished, but it was restated in the Stafford Act, which we think of for use in natural disaster relief, in Title VI, but no one's ever looked at it since because that environment disappeared, right? Although I will point out that that civil defense, if you look at that, is clearly meant to be activities that the civilian government, that civilians can take on to remove that burden from the military, who you are trying to orient as much as possible on their national security, their wartime needs, because they have those unique capabilities. Civil defense, in fact, on paper, of course, still belongs to FEMA. And again, I should point out, this is all in my personal capacity. I'm not picking on my old office, but nonetheless, again, this transition, none of the people who are there now were a part of, occurred in 93, 94. And the best example I can give is from the Defense Production Act. So the Defense Production Act until 1994, its definition of national defense was national defense. It was purely wartime focused. In 1994, as part of this transition, Congress changed the definition of national defense to include emergency preparedness, which is all hazards, hurricanes, floods, everything. They wanted to make these tools available to the next generation. They later specifically added the word Homeland Security. The problem is the thought that might go into using these tools that were once prepared for a war with the Soviet Union that could have transitioned over to a whole of nation emergency. The office, this Federal Preparedness Policy and Planning Office, about 25 people, have been shut down the year before. So there was nobody looking at how could we take these tools that were once oriented for whole of nation or government and transition them to a future period where we might need them for those same reasons, or quite possibly for a true national catastrophe like a pandemic, which explains again why so much of this was being done so quickly and without a lot of guidance, because again, we didn't have those capabilities or those plans in place. So for instance, skipping ahead a little bit here, but for instance, the last executive order for national mobilization done by the president is from President Reagan in 1982, right? Executive Order 12656 for national security emergencies, it's from 1988. But it's very clear that even if we think of them in their Cold War context, they were specifically focused on all hazards. So I can even read quickly from the mobilization order from 1982. There's a whole section on health. It is the policy of the United States to develop systems and plans to ensure that sufficient medical personnel, supplies, equipment, and facilities will be available and deployed to meet essential civilian and military healthcare needs in an emergency. And the program will enhance the nation's ability to recover from major emergencies and protect the population from the spread of disease, supplement medical services, provide medical care, allocate scarce supplies and skilled professionals, specialists to the highest priority needs. So what's interesting is when you look back at the language, it was very clearly all hazards. So as Trey said, I need to wrap up here. Apologize for going over. But again, I wanted to give you an example of some of the work I've had compared to Supply Chain Task Force, where because of the centralized industry, and Admiral Kolachek hopefully will have a lot more to say in this a couple of days, we were able to, in that one area, we were able to mobilize the nation using Defense Production Act authorities and things we hadn't used in decades, get visibility to the president, all the governors, et cetera, and then expand production, et cetera. Again, hearkening back these capabilities that once existed. And quite frankly, I think we probably need to look at again as they may be, I can tell you, from my opinion, would certainly have been of value last year. And I think they clearly be of value in the future. So the last thing, Trey, I will say this is the example I'll give is what song are we going to leave? And I say that from the context of the Indonesian tsunami earlier this century, right? There was a tribe, I think it was the Nia tribe, lived right on the ocean. Only 7 members of their tribe died. And the reason is in 1907, they had a major earthquake and tsunami, and they embedded a song in their culture that they sang for 100 years. And when that day came, when the water receded, that tribe was ready. They knew to head to high ground, and they saved innumerable lives. So my question would be moving forward to this group and others is what song are we going to leave in the wake of COVID-19? How are we going to learn that, and how are we going to pass it on to our future generations? So thank you, Trey, back to you.
Thanks, Quinn. That was a great way to wrap the talk up. For some reason, there we go. I'm back live again. I have 2 questions for each of you. We have about 30 minutes, a little less than 30 minutes to answer these. So if you could limit your answers to maybe 5 minutes a piece, and kind of include whatever wrap up you have, guidance you have. And as with any good set of questions, you don't have to answer the one I ask if you've got something you want to wrap up with. But I'm going to start with Brigadier General Brody, and this goes very close to the question that was asked of you in the chat box. And Nate, I'll ask you to go to the Q&A box and read the question that was asked of you as well. But I was wondering, General Brody, what is the military's role to motivate a national preparedness mindset and to coordinate that public-private partnership to facilitate resourcing and planning and exercises before an exercise starts? And the second half of that question is the scope of the potential threat so broad that it defies preparation? Must we just adapt on the fly and respond to the context of either a contextual or purposeful threat in the future?
So I will offer a few thoughts to that. So regarding the military's role in driving a national preparedness mindset, I would offer that as a vital and necessary national institution, the military really does have a role in that space and historically has done that. And I think sometimes we have fallen, kind of back on our heels with respect to being a paragon of leadership in in that space, while recognizing that there are natural tensions and frictions with respect to kind of the legal premise of the military being subservient and responsive to civilian leadership and to the duly elected government of the day, but that they're not mutually exclusive, that we can in that very necessary and rightful position of being responsive and subservient to civilian power, to duly elected civilian power, that that there is a real role for us to provide leadership in that multi-dimensional space, and part of that is leveraging our our ingrained competencies, because we don't just focus on a single pillar or domain, but we really do act as a microcosm of all of those capabilities that are represented within the national ecosystem. And so to be able to be a bit of the connective tissue and the fiber that binds the warp and weft of government departments and of society writ large, the fact that we really do have tentacles that reach into every community. We do that both not only in in our organizational structures, but with our connections to the reserves and to the Canadian Rangers. We really are far and wide in the fabric of Canadian society, and and well positioned by by both accident and design as an integrator of across government departments and at all levels of government. We see that with the regional joint task forces and their liaison officers in at the municipal and at the provincial level, and those relationships honed through responses to things like floods and forest fires. So, so I think there is an opportunity within the appropriately kind of managed context for the Canadian Armed Forces to, to provide a very influential voice within that national preparedness mindset space. With respect to the scope of potential threats being so wide that they defy preparation, so we're in the business of crisis leadership, of imagining the absolute worst possible course of action, and and assessing all of the levers and options that could potentially be brought to play in order to, to mitigate and then to balance and respond and recover. So, so I would say that we would be remiss and irresponsible if we were not, continually taking almost a futures mindset with respect to what those potentials threats are, continually scanning the environment, doing that intelligence preparation of that battle space, but more importantly, doing the practical dimensions of things like the logistics preparation of the battle space. So we know where our capabilities are, what the capacities are, what the foundational elements are, and the potential that offers us in terms of like residual and redundant supply chain capacity across a much broader enterprise when we think about not only what is available across industry, but then what is available in a whole of government context, and then layer on the CAF capabilities on top of that. That provides a depth and breadth of a potential capacity that I think demands as opposed to defies preparation. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were excellent responses. I'm going to go to Quinn next and let Nate wrap it up at the end. But my two questions to you, Quinn: what is the first step to address and build a future whole of government preparedness and response effort? You laid out great stuff from history, and you're so intimately familiar with the history of our policies. I'd really like to know what you think now is the first step towards building that future that you're looking for. And then my second question is motivating public and private resource expenditure for this nebulous, purposeful threat. So if we are, how do we convince, particularly the private sector, but also our other interagency partners outside of DHS and FEMA, that expending time and money prior to being attacked or having a national crisis is worthy of their budget and time considerations? Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah. So to answer the first one, I think it's a recognition of the problem, right? And specifically, this, as you've heard discussed, the need to potentially prepare for a whole of government leading a whole of nation response to something. It doesn't have to be a war necessarily. It can be a pandemic. It could be a terrible earthquake that strikes an essential part of your nation, right? So it's a recognition of that issue and providing for, again, the United States, we're going to have to, there's a cultural change of understanding. We have to prepare to flip that natural relationship with the federal government assisting and supporting the states. Now the federal government is in the lead. And when I say directing, they are providing direction. Maybe there is some directing, but there's still inalienable decisions between governors and presidents, right? But it's recognizing that there is an issue, that there's a need to bring that back. And as I was mentioned to our group beforehand, I have a memo from 1988 from the late General Powell, who actually had a lot to do with the early version of the Federal Response Plan, the NRF that we know now, believe it or not, specifically directing the creation of a national security emergency plan to ensure effective interagency coordination of federal activities in response to domestic disasters of national significance, right? So even General Powell 30 years ago understood this. And so it's recognition, right? The second thing is, obviously competition for resources and money. There's no way around it. I think you can leverage a lot of the things the federal government has done very well. The unity of effort that has been this idea of unity of effort that's been created between the federal and state governments, public and private sector, right? You can leverage that. There's a lot of information sharing, whether it's in cyberspace, in the business space, with communities. There's a lot of places that you can work on. But I'll pick on, again, the Defense Production Act, right? There's 3 titles to it, 1, 3, and 7. When people think of the DPA, they always jump to Title I, which is really the tail end. It's prioritizing contracts on behalf of the federal government. It's, if necessary, allocating resources from one sector of the country or one sector of the economy to another, right? Which is pretty intense stuff, potentially, right? But they don't talk about Title III business expansion of industry, growing industry proactively or after the event, right? The carrots, only the Department of Defense has a Title III program, and it's not even the full parameter of what's available under Title III to work with and expand industry preemptively, right? And then there's Title VII, which is really preparedness. It has the National Defense Executive Reserve, which once had thousands of members, where you had key members of the private sector, senior executives who said, I'll become a temporary federal employee if something really bad happens, and I'll come in, and as a federal employee, I will help the federal government figure out what's going on and lead all the resource needs, right? They know the players. We actually had a gentleman just like that who helped us so much on PPE on our daily calls with the 5 major distributors plus 2 other companies that, luckily, because of the centralized nature of things, we got it. We knew where things were going, right? He was the living, breathing example of that National Defense Executive Reserve. And the last part, again, voluntary agreements. We did the first one and really new one in probably 50 years, rebuilding those intense bonds between the private and public sector, where we can go potentially all the way to harnessing their capabilities and knowing what their bottlenecks and impediments are at the national level, the big boards, building those back, not the ad hoc regional or one-offs that are based around essentially normal federal contracting and procurement, right? Potentially harnessing all those activities. So recognition of the problem, and I'll pick on the Defense Production Act, bring back some of those capabilities and use them in this all hazards arena that Congress has always wanted us to do for the last 30 years, but we just haven't resourced.
Thanks, Quinn. And I am having a hard time getting my video to restart. Okay, there we go. Nate, I've got 2 questions for you. The first one is a spin-off of the one that is in the Q&A, but I believe you talked about the social media narrative as one of the lines of operation for our pacing threats, and the other was cyber and the electromagnetic spectrum threat. It was characterized in the Q&A as dematerialized threats. And do you think that that plays a greater role to a militarization of the problem over a more traditional violence, kinetic violence threat or direct attack? The second question that I have is, it's not even a question. It's you had a very good and detailed briefing, based on now several years of work, getting to that. But I want you to animate that for us a little bit. If you could tell us a story that describes a scenario where an opportunistic bandwagoning threat or a complementary individual action threat operates across multiple of the 5 vectors, creating that hybrid cocktail that might lead to an existential cascading national failure.
Okay, so I'll take the first one. I'll take the first question on social media. I actually wrote it down and answered it. I answered it in writing because I wanted to make sure I got it 100% correct. And I know I was moving very fast in my briefing, but of the 5 vectors that we outlined in our work, we suggest as of now that the cognitive social civic vector, which is that which applies to narrative, and in fact, I wanted to refer directly to it because we did do a ton of work on this. The weaponization of political organization and action, the art of persuasion, and the employment of information and disinformation to manipulate, lead in popular perception, meaning, and judgment and reasoning. This vector challenges legitimacy of strategic decision-making and risk calculus, erodes popular political will, undermines social cohesion, and weakens popular confidence in the prevailing social contract. We believe that, in combination with the cyber EMS vectors, probably at this point the most problematic, and that physical force and violence is there more because of the shock effect that it has than anything else. A nation that's going to be able to employ resources in economics or CBRN or things like that, those are probably less likely. And again, it's this lower risk, higher payoff approach. If you can actually circumvent traditional defenses and go directly to people's minds, you have developed a capability that's a decided advantage over people that want to go straight to military coercion. So my answer to Colonel Guerin specifically, but to the group in general, is that yeah, the cognitive, social, and civic vector and the cyber EMS vector are probably the most problematic to not just the United States, but to all governments concerned with homeland security. And the ability of those two vectors specifically to trigger cascading failure in one or more critical functions, I think is obvious, to tell you the truth. As for animating, providing an animating sort of example, I mean, there's a number of micro examples right now that I think we should be quite worried about, and they actually fall into the COG, social, civic, cyber EMS. I mean, the fact that the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg was able to actually trigger countervailing protests on opposite street corners with Americans at odds against each other on a particular subject is just a small example of how you can actually circumvent traditional military defenses and basically pit populations against one another, right? A single population against one another. And that's one example. The other one, one recent one that comes to mind too, is the Indian blackouts that are purportedly attributed to China, and the challenge that provided. The scariest one that came up in our frankly, one of the scariest ones that came up in our in our research was a violent event, right? Physical force and violence, a mass casualty event accompanied by shutting down of emergency communication, so that first responders and emergency services are simply not able to respond effectively because they can't communicate with each other. And these are all real possibilities that lie on the horizon. I mean, the whole challenge of what if the Chinese liquidate all of our bank accounts in cyberspace and things like that. I mean, these are probably the more fantastical ones. The real challenges right now are the ability of people to circumvent military defenses, to actually go directly to individuals and change perceptions in ways that undermine confidence in civil authorities and actually turn constituent populations within a target country against one another. And I think that portends a new era of very frightening homeland security challenges. And oh, by the way, it doesn't have to be a foreign entity that does it. It could very easily be a domestic entity that does the same thing. And in fact, there are some pretty significant examples from recent election, and I'm not just talking about the 2016 election and the questions surrounding the former president, but there are examples of people creating false narratives around candidates that stuck. and they have nothing to do with reality. And as a result of that, eroded just enough popular support for that candidate to tip the balance of an election. So, I mean, those are kind of examples in my mind. I think, you know, everybody wants to talk about the catastrophic explosion in downtown New York, but I think we've seen over the last, I don't know, let's just say 5 years now, but it's been coming for quite some time, that the manipulation of ones and zeros and the irresponsible use of information is just as effective. It's lower risk to the aggressor, and it is at times likely much higher payoff than an attributable, you know, kinetic attack.
Thanks, Nate. I'm going to just throw in here because I think it's so important. Take the chair's privilege here and say, this is not a future threat. As you were just pointing out in the election piece, Russia's involvement in the Ukraine with manipulating media and populations with false narratives, attacks in our own country on our financial institutions that were successful and shut down Wall Street, and attacks to our electric grid and to our power supplies, whomever did it, and domestic volatility created by the shortages and the chaos that could surround that. If that ever animated into attacks on, you know, day-to-day things like Walmart's, Target stores, grocery stores, this type of thing, where we have panics. You saw a little bit of that during the pandemic with some critical supplies, cleaning supplies, personal protective equipment, toilet paper, that type of thing. It would not be a big stretch for me to see communities or constituencies motivated through social media false narratives to actually engage each other in a catastrophic way for the nation. And I worry that the military thinks so much about playing in the away game or doing recovery operations to re-engage or regenerate supply chains or electrical or do distribution operations. That's a part of the problem. But if it becomes domestically volatile, I don't think the military's really thought through, at least the US military has thought through completely how we would respond, what our appropriate role was, and where we would take that direction if we had contesting internal divisions amongst constituencies, much less between the federal and state that Quinn so eloquently pointed out. With that, I'm going to ask one last question.
Trey, can I add just one? I have 10 seconds. The one conversation we had in our group as we went through this process is you can very easily see China at some point having the capacity, given what we know happened in Texas with the electrical grid. We have to be worried about a rival like China basically giving you the Texas or Taiwan dilemma, right? So a move against Taiwan and coupled with the ability to actually influence some critical function inside the United States and basically ask the United States which one's more important, right? That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is don't ignore the ability of the contextual threat and the purposeful threat coexisting. I mean, the purposeful threat can be created by the context, it can free ride on the context, right? Or it can exploit the context. And those are becoming increasingly apparent going forward as we come out of the pandemic, quite frankly.
And General Brody, I have one more question for you that came up from our audience member, talking about the Canadian Armed Forces achievements and reorganization that was motivated by the pandemic. What have we learned as a Canadian Armed Forces, and what are the achievements that are going to be enduring for better addressing a future threat. And if you could keep your comments fairly short, some of the organizers would like to make some wrap-up comments before we close out with the translators at 1:50. Thank you.
So I will offer that it has been an opportunity to serve Canada and Canadians in a time of crisis. This is why we joined. It's allowed us to build trust and enduring relationships, to renew and create critical partnerships. It's increased our profile in a vast array of occupations and operational expertise on offer in and by the Canadian Armed Forces. It's allowed us to hone individual and collective skills, to build experience for future operations, to challenge out-of-date assumptions, and to encourage the adoption of an agile and adaptive mindset and more employment model. As we consolidate on the objective and undertake a deliberate regrouping, there is a tremendous potential to enhance and expand our operational reach and our overall resilience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You did better than most of us on succinctness there. Covered a lot of information in the answer. I want to thank very much General Brody, Nate, and Quinn for this panel. I'm going to definitely be watching the recording. Being the chair, I get a little caught up in the management of it, and there was so much information in each one of the presentations. It's worthy of going back over in a more relaxed setting when I'm not thinking about my chair responsibilities. But I do appreciate all three of you giving such well thought out and well organized and quite dense in a good way material for us to think about and to kick this conference off. With that, I will turn it back over. I'm not sure if I'm turning it back over to Stephanie or to our MC, but whomever.
Okay, thank you, Professor Braun, and thank you to the panel, especially to General Brody, Nate Fryer, and Harold, for your very informative discussions and insights into the lessons learned and how they will apply to the future, both for a pandemic and other national level crisis. I also want to thank General Iyer for his keynote speech this morning and the lessons that the Canadian Armed Forces have taken into account in adapting their training, operations, and partnership. Just want to highlight for tomorrow when we resume the conference, key topics will be first on Canadian national security lessons on the stress test of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then this panel will go into sort of the allied experiences and responses from various perspectives from the US, NATO, and New Zealand. Again, you can follow the conference at the KCIS Twitter handle at KCIS 2021, and then follow in terms of the website and the biographies again at the KCIS.org webpage.